A quiet neighborhood, no more. The morning sun glinted off Betty Thompson's garden shears as the 80-year-old widow trimmed her prized rose bush. Her hands, gnarled with age and arthritis, still moved with delicate precision, as if muscle memory could defy the passage of time. Gardening was her favorite pastime, a ritual of care that filled her lonely hours since her husband George passed away 5 years ago. Every flower bed held memories. The hydrangeas he planted for their anniversary, the lilacs that lined the fence they'd built together. The street outside, once bustling with children's laughter and neighborhood block parties, had grown eerily silent over the years. Families moved away, houses were sold, and the lively community faded into stillness. Betty was one of the last remaining pieces of the neighborhood's golden years, clinging to the memories like ivy to an old stone wall. On this quiet morning, Betty was engrossed in her thoughts until the low rumble of an engine broke the silence. Startled, she straightened, squinting down the street as a large moving truck rolled to a stop in front of the vacant house next door. Her heart lifted. New neighbors. It had been months since anyone had expressed interest in the old, weather-beaten property. Betty felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, these new residents would breathe life back into the neighborhood. Perhaps a family with young children, she mused wistfully. From the truck emerged a slim woman in her early 30s. Her dark skin shimmered in the morning sun, and her vibrant orange sundress fluttered in the breeze. Betty noted the mix of excitement and nervousness etched on her face as she took in her surroundings. Behind her came two small girls, identical in every way. Same short curls, same wide, curious eyes. They couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Their matching purple backpacks jostled with each bouncy step. The girls giggled as they hopped down from the truck, their voices lifting the silence like birdsong. Betty's heart softened. Twins. What a rare and delightful surprise. It had been so long since she'd heard children's voices on the street. The sight tugged at something deep within her, a longing she hadn't realized she still carried. She raised her hand in a warm wave. Just then, the driver's side door of the truck swung open, and a tall, burly man stepped out. His features were sharp, and his expression unreadable as he surveyed the neighborhood. Betty's brow furrowed. Something about the man unsettled her. He was white, unlike the woman and children, and his body language didn't match the scene she had been constructing in her mind. Maybe he's just helping with the move, Betty thought. But a nagging discomfort wormed its way into her thoughts. The woman caught Betty's gaze and smiled warmly, momentarily easing her doubts. Betty returned the smile, but the man's arrival cast a shadow over the moment. He leaned toward the woman, speaking low enough that Betty couldn't hear, but his posture was tense, possessive even. Betty's sense of unease deepened. She decided not to intrude just yet. Give them time, she whispered to herself, her eyes lingering on the twins until they disappeared into the house. She could welcome them tomorrow, with a cake. But later that night, the unsettling quiet was broken again. Betty sat in her cozy living room, wrapped in a soft quilt as the television flickered in the background. A gentle fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm shadows across the room. But despite the comfort of her familiar routine, something gnawed at her, a persistent feeling she couldn't shake. Just as she was beginning to relax, a sudden loud bang echoed through the walls, making her jolt upright. Her heart raced as the noise was followed by what sounded like a high-pitched cry. Sharp, frightened, and unmistakably a child's voice. Betty froze, listening intently, but the night grew eerily silent again. She sat on the edge of her armchair, straining her ears. Were those screams real? Or had the loneliness of the evening played tricks on her mind? She thought about the little twins next door, their innocent faces flashing across her thoughts. Betty considered going over, but hesitation rooted her to the spot. What if it was just a tantrum? Moving can be hard for children, especially in a new, unfamiliar place. She didn't want to appear nosy on their first night. Still, the sounds gnawed at her. The bang had been too violent, the cry too desperate. Something wasn't right. Betty stared at the darkened windows next door. the unease in her chest coiling tighter with every second of silence. "I'll check on them in the morning," she decided, though the thought did little to calm her nerves. She banked the fire, turned off the television, and went to bed, but her sleep was restless and fragmented, haunted by worries she couldn't quite articulate. A cake for new beginnings. The next morning dawned bright and clear, chasing away the shadows of Betty's troubled night. Determined to put her worries aside, she resolved to welcome her new neighbors properly. She shuffled into the kitchen, pulling out her mixing bowls and ingredients. Betty chose a lemon drizzle cake, a foolproof recipe passed down from her mother. As she whisked eggs and measured sugar, the familiar routine soothed her nerves. By the time the cake was baking, the kitchen filled with a comforting aroma of citrus and vanilla. She dressed in her best floral blouse and cardigan, wanting to make a good impression. Carefully boxing up the cake, she rehearsed what she would say. "Hello, I'm Betty from next door. I thought I'd bring over a little something to welcome you." The cake felt like more than just a gesture. It was an olive branch, a bridge toward new friendships. With the box cradled in her hands, Betty made her way next door. The house looked as silent and lifeless as it had the night before. The curtains were still drawn, and no sounds came from within. She hesitated at the door, but then squared her shoulders and rang the bell. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing the woman from the previous day. Up close, Betty noticed the tiredness in her eyes, a heaviness that didn't match the woman's smile. "Good morning," Betty said cheerfully, holding out the cake. "I'm Betty, your neighbor. I thought I'd bring you a little welcome gift." The woman, Melanie, smiled, the warmth in her eyes genuine but tinged with something unspoken. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Thompson. That's very kind of you." Just as Betty was about to ask if the girls were settling in, a heavy shadow loomed behind Melanie. The man from the day before stepped into view, his presence filling the doorway and altering the atmosphere instantly. "Who's this?" he asked gruffly, his eyes narrowing as they locked on Betty. "This is Betty, our neighbor," Melanie said quickly. "She brought us a welcome cake." The man, Tom, as Betty would learn, grunted. "Thanks, but we're busy unpacking," he said curtly, stepping between Betty and Melanie as if to block her from view. Betty's heart sank at his cold demeanor, but she forced a smile. "Of course, I just wanted to say welcome. Perhaps you'd like to come over for coffee sometime." Tom's posture stiffened. "We'll see," he muttered, already beginning to close the door. Melanie shot Betty an apologetic glance. "It really was kind of you," she whispered before the door clicked shut. Betty stood on the porch for a moment, the boxed cake still warm in her hands. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones, but she wasn't sure what it was. As she turned to head back home, Betty couldn't shake the unsettling thought that something far more serious was happening behind those closed doors. And somehow, she knew she had to find out what it was. A cry for help. Betty tried to push the unsettling encounter with Tom out of her mind, but the worry clung to her like damp clothes on a stormy day. Days passed, and despite her efforts to distract herself with gardening and household chores, the house next door remained eerily quiet. She hadn't seen the girls playing outside, or even a light on in the evenings. It was as if the new family had vanished inside those four walls, locked away from the world. Her thoughts kept circling back to Melanie and the strange tension she had sensed. The young mother's smile had been warm, but Betty hadn't missed the exhaustion in her eyes, or the way Tom had loomed over her, as if controlling even the air she breathed. Betty had lived long enough to recognize when something was off. Then, one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Betty heard it again, a soft knock at her door. At first, she thought she had imagined it, but the knock came again, urgent yet timid. Betty shuffled to the door, her heart thudding in her chest, and when she opened it, there they were. The two little girls stood on her porch, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Their hair was unkempt, and their clothes were wrinkled, as if they had slept in them for days. One clutched a worn stuffed bear, its once bright fur now dull with age. The other held her sister's hand tightly, as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Hello, dears," Betty whispered, bending slightly to meet them at eye level. "Are you all right?" The girls exchanged glances, and the bolder of the two, Betty guessed she was the older twin by mere minutes, stepped forward. "Can we come inside?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Betty's heart clenched. Of course, come in." She ushered them inside, gently closing the door behind them. The girls stood awkwardly in the hallway, as if unsure of what to do next. Betty knelt down, her old knees protesting, and gave them a reassuring smile. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked the older twin. "Amara," the girl whispered, shifting on her feet. "And this is Alina." Betty nodded warmly. "It's so nice to meet you both. Would you like some milk and cookies?" The girls nodded eagerly, and Betty's heart lightened, if only for a moment. As she bustled into the kitchen to prepare the snacks, she couldn't help but wonder what had brought them here. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones. When she returned to the living room with 2 plates of cookies and glasses of milk, the twins were huddled together on the couch, whispering in hushed tones. As soon as they saw Betty, they fell silent, their small faces guarded. Betty set the plates on the coffee table and sat down across from them. "There you go, my loves. Eat as much as you want." The girls hesitated for a moment, then dug into the cookies with the kind of hunger that made Betty's heart ache. When was the last time they had a proper meal? She waited until they had eaten their fill before gently asking, "Now, why don't you tell me what's going on? Why did you come here tonight?" The twins exchanged another glance, and then Amara leaned in closer, lowering her voice as if afraid someone might overhear. "We need help," she whispered. "We're not supposed to talk to anyone, but—" She trailed off, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Betty reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "It's all right, dear. You can tell me anything. I promise I'll help you." Amara took a deep breath, as if gathering all her courage. "Tom's not nice," she whispered. "He gets really angry. Mama tries to stop him, but he hurts her." Betty's blood ran cold. She knew something was wrong. She had seen the signs, but hearing it confirmed from the lips of a child was far worse than anything she had imagined. "He locked us in our room," Alina added quietly, her voice trembling. "He said we weren't allowed to leave, not even for dinner." Betty's hands clenched in her lap, her heart pounding with fury and sorrow. She could feel the ache of her arthritic fingers, but she ignored it. These little girls were in trouble, and their mother was too. Amara sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "We didn't know where else to go. Mama said you were kind, so we thought maybe you could help." Betty's heart shattered at the innocence and trust in those words. She reached out and pulled the girls into a gentle embrace, feeling their small bodies tremble against her. "You did the right thing, my loves," she whispered. "You're safe here now." But even as she spoke the words, Betty knew that keeping them safe wouldn't be easy. Tom was dangerous, and he wasn't going to let go of control without a fight. A plan takes shape. Betty knew she couldn't confront Tom directly. He was younger, stronger, and unpredictable. But she also knew she couldn't let the girls return to that house, not with the danger they faced. She needed a plan. As the girls huddled under a blanket on her couch, Betty sat down at the kitchen table with a notepad, jotting down her thoughts. The first step was making sure Melanie knew her daughters were safe. She considered calling the police, but something in her gut told her that might backfire. What if Tom had a way of twisting the truth? She needed to be smart about this. Betty's thoughts raced as she scribbled notes. She decided she would send a discreet message to Melanie, letting her know the girls were with her. If Melanie was ready to leave Tom, Betty would help her escape. But if not, Betty would keep the girls safe until she could figure out the next steps. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote out the plan, but her resolve was unshakable. She would not allow those girls, or their mother, to suffer any longer. She had lived through too many years of silence and regret. This time, she would act. Betty glanced over at the twins, who had fallen asleep, their little hands still clutching each other tightly. A fierce protectiveness welled up within her. No matter what happened, she wouldn't let anyone hurt these children again. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket. At first light, she would slip it through the mail slot at Melanie's house. But tonight, she would stay up and keep watch over the girls. As the night stretched on, Betty sat by the window, her old bones aching, but her spirit unwavering. She was just an old woman, yes, but even old women could fight for what was right, and Betty Thompson was ready to fight with everything she had. Secrets in the shadows. The night crept on, silent except for the ticking of Betty's old clock and the occasional soft murmur from the twins as they stirred in their sleep. She sat in her armchair, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the darkened house next door. Something told her this night would change everything, and she had to be ready. At dawn, Betty rose stiffly from her seat, the ache in her joints gnawing at her, but she pushed it aside. With quiet care, she tucked the girls under a second blanket and made her way to the kitchen. She pulled the note she had written to Melanie from her apron pocket, her fingers tracing over the hastily scribbled words. "Your girls are safe with me. If you're ready to leave, slip a scarf through the mail slot tonight. I'll be watching." With the note folded tightly in her palm, she stepped onto her front porch, the morning air cool against her skin. The house next door loomed quiet and still, almost as if it was holding its breath. Betty approached cautiously, her slippers shuffling against the damp grass. At the door, she slid the note through the mail slot and then hurried back to her own house. Now all she could do was wait. A ray of hope. By noon, the twins were awake and eating a hearty breakfast: toast, scrambled eggs, and fruit. Betty smiled as they giggled softly, a hint of brightness finally returning to their young faces. "What's going to happen now?" Amara asked between bites. Her voice carried a weight no child should ever have to bear. Betty knelt beside them. "Don't you worry, my loves. We'll figure everything out. You just stay close to me, all right?" Alina nodded solemnly, her small hand resting in Betty's wrinkled palm. It was a fragile connection, but Betty knew it was enough. They trusted her, and she wouldn't let them down. A signal in the night. As evening approached, Betty kept a close watch on the house next door, her nerves fraying with every passing hour. She knew the risks Melanie faced. If Tom suspected anything, things could spiral out of control quickly. The twins were tucked safely in her guest room, fast asleep once again. Betty had told them a bedtime story, one about a wise old owl who protected two little songbirds from a storm. It wasn't much, but the girls had clung to every word, drifting off with faint smiles on their faces. Just after midnight, Betty saw it, a soft flicker of movement through her lace curtains. A narrow strip of fabric slipped silently through the mail slot next door and fluttered onto the porch. The scarf. Melanie had given the signal. She was ready to escape. Betty's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of relief and fear. This was it. They had to move quickly. The escape begins. Betty wasted no time. She grabbed a small backpack she had prepared earlier with snacks, water, and a few essentials for the girls. There wasn't a moment to lose. She knew Tom would notice sooner or later that something was wrong, and when he did, there was no telling what he might do. She tiptoed to the guest room and gently shook the twins awake. "Time to go, my loves," she whispered. "We need to help your mama." The girls rubbed their sleepy eyes but obeyed without question, slipping into their shoes as Betty guided them to the back door. She had lived in this house for over 50 years. She knew every creak in the floorboards and every shadow in the garden. They slipped out into the cool night air, moving like ghosts through Betty's rose bushes. The moonlight cast soft silver beams across the yard, and the scent of night-blooming flowers drifted around them. Betty led them to the side gate and whispered, "Stay right here and be quiet, all right? I'll bring your mama." The girls nodded, their little hands clutching each other for comfort. Into the lion's den. Betty took a deep breath and crossed the lawn to Melanie's front door. Her heart thudded in her chest as she gently tapped twice, a signal they had agreed upon in the note. A moment later, the door cracked open, and Melanie peeked out, her eyes wide with fear but filled with determination. "Are they safe?" she whispered urgently. Betty nodded. "They're waiting by the gate, but we need to move fast." Melanie clutched Betty's hand for a brief moment, a silent thank you passing between them. She stepped out into the night, wearing nothing but an old sweatshirt and jeans, her dark hair pulled into a hasty ponytail. Betty could see the bruise on her cheek, a dark, ugly mark of Tom's rage. The two women crept toward the garden gate, where the twins waited with silent anticipation. When they saw their mother, they rushed into her arms, clinging to her as if they would never let go. "Chère, my darlings," Melanie whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We're going somewhere safe now." The close call. Just as they reached the gate, a loud bang shattered the stillness of the night, a door slamming open. Betty's heart jumped into her throat. She turned and saw Tom standing on the porch, his silhouette menacing in the dim light. "Melanie," he roared, "where do you think you're going?" Melanie froze, clutching the twins tighter. But Betty didn't hesitate. She stepped between them and Tom, her small frame unwavering. "You'll stay right where you are, Tom," Betty said, her voice steady despite the fear prickling her skin. "These girls, and their mother, are leaving with me." Tom stormed down the steps, his fists clenched. "You've got no right." "I have every right," Betty interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "And if you take one more step, the police will be here before you can say another word." She reached into her pocket and flashed her phone. "I already sent them a message." It was a bluff, but Tom didn't know that. He froze in his tracks, his eyes darting toward the street, as if expecting flashing lights to appear at any moment. "Get back inside, Tom," Betty said firmly. "It's over." For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a curse, Tom turned on his heel and stomped back into the house, slamming the door behind him. Betty exhaled, her hands shaking slightly. They had done it. Freedom at last. Melanie sobbed quietly as they hurried down the street, the twins clinging to her sides. Betty led them to her old station wagon parked a block away, out of sight from Tom's house. She had borrowed it from a neighbor earlier that evening, just in case. "Where are we going?" Amara whispered as Betty helped them into the back seat. "To a friend of mine," Betty said gently. "Someone who helps women like your mama. You're going to be safe now, I promise." As the car rumbled to life, and they drove away from the nightmare they had endured, Betty felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't just an escape, it was a new beginning. For Melanie, for the girls, and, in a way, for Betty too. She smiled softly, gripping the steering wheel with firm hands. They had made it. They were free. New horizons and second chances. The station wagon rumbled down the dark road, the silence inside broken only by the hum of the engine and the soft breathing of the twins, who had fallen asleep, heads resting on their mother's lap. Betty glanced at Melanie in the rearview mirror. The young mother sat rigid, her eyes still shimmering with fear. But beneath that fear was something new. Hope. "We'll be there soon," Betty whispered reassuringly. Melanie nodded but said nothing, brushing a stray curl from Amara's forehead as the little girl stirred in her sleep. They were heading toward a domestic violence shelter Betty had contacted earlier, run by her old friend Laura. Betty had explained everything in a brief message earlier that night, and Laura had responded immediately. "Bring them. I'll have a room ready." The road stretched on, each passing mile putting more distance between them and the nightmare they were escaping. A fresh start was waiting just a little farther ahead. Arriving at Sanctuary, the station wagon pulled up to a modest two-story house, tucked at the end of a quiet street lined with oak trees. A small weathered sign by the door read, "Hope Haven, a place to begin again." Laura's shelter was discreet but well known in the community, a lifeline for women who had nowhere else to turn. As Betty turned off the engine, the front door opened, and Laura stepped out, her silver hair glinting in the porch light. She waved warmly, her eyes soft with kindness. "You must be Melanie," Laura said as the young woman climbed out of the car, holding each of her daughter's hands tightly. "Welcome, sweetheart. Let's get you all inside." The twins clung to their mother's legs, still groggy from sleep, but aware enough to sense they were somewhere new, somewhere safe. Betty helped carry their small bag to the door. As they crossed the threshold, Melanie's shoulders slumped, the weight of years of fear and exhaustion finally lifting, even if only slightly. Laura led them to a cozy room with 2 twin beds, soft blankets folded neatly on top. "This will be your space for as long as you need," she said gently. "We'll talk more in the morning. Tonight, just rest." Melanie choked back a sob, overwhelmed by the kindness she hadn't known in so long. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No thanks needed," Laura replied warmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore." The first steps forward. Over the next few days, Betty visited often, bringing homemade meals and small gifts for the girls, coloring books, puzzles, and little stuffed animals that quickly became their treasured companions. Each time she saw Melanie, she noticed small but significant changes. A little more color in her cheeks, a bit more strength in her posture, and most importantly, the beginning of a smile. The girls, too, seemed to blossom. They played in the shelter's backyard, their giggles filling the air, a sound Betty had missed so dearly in her quiet neighborhood. It was as if they were rediscovering their childhood, one playful moment at a time. Melanie began attending counseling sessions at the shelter and started working with Laura on a plan for the future. "I want to find a job," she told Betty one afternoon over tea. "Something steady, so I can give my girls the life they deserve." Betty nodded approvingly. "You will, dear. You've got a strength in you, Melanie, a strength I don't think you even realize yet." Melanie smiled, her gratitude shining through. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Betty reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "We're neighbors now, and neighbors help each other. A new kind of neighborhood." In the following weeks, Betty took it upon herself to introduce the other neighbors to Melanie and the girls. Slowly but surely, the tight-lipped, quiet street began to awaken again. The families who had kept to themselves began to open their doors, their hearts touched by the bravery of the young mother and her children. Betty's garden became the heart of the neighborhood, a place where people gathered for afternoon tea. Children played among the roses, and friendships blossomed. Melanie found a job at a nearby cafe, and the twins started attending school, where they quickly made friends. For the first time in years, they felt like they belonged somewhere, and they thrived. One sunny afternoon, Betty stood in her garden, watching Melanie chase the girls around the yard, their laughter ringing out like music. It was a moment Betty never thought she'd see. A mother free from fear, children bursting with joy, and a neighborhood alive with connection. A last confrontation. But not everything was behind them yet. One rainy afternoon, Tom appeared on the street, a grim expression on his face. Betty saw him from her kitchen window and knew immediately why he was there. He wasn't ready to let go. She hurried outside and intercepted him at the gate. "You have no right to be here, Tom," she said, her voice firm. "Those are my girls," Tom growled. "I want them back." Betty stood her ground, unflinching. "You gave up that right the moment you hurt them. And if you think for 1 second that I'll let you near them again, you've got another thing coming." Tom sneered, but before he could respond, a police car pulled up. Laura had notified the authorities as part of the shelter's protocol, and officers quickly escorted Tom away, warning him to stay away for good. As the rain began to fall, Betty exhaled slowly, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The storm had finally passed. A new beginning for all. Months later, Betty sat in her garden once more, sipping her tea as the autumn leaves drifted down from the trees. Melanie and the twins joined her, their laughter mingling with the crisp breeze. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Melanie asked quietly, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and curiosity. Betty smiled softly. "Not a bitch," she said, "because this is what life is supposed to be." The neighborhood, once so silent and lonely, had become vibrant again. The families gathered regularly, children's laughter filled the air, and everyone looked out for one another. Betty's house, once a quiet sanctuary for one, had become a place where second chances bloomed, just like her roses. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, Betty looked around at the people she had grown to love. She had thought her life was winding down, but instead it was beginning anew. And for Melanie, the twins, and everyone who had found their way to Hope Haven, the future looked brighter than ever.